today we're kind of doing this a little bit in order, but Robyn is going to be starting out the program with a great deal of solid information that we need. That's the foundation for some of the work that you'll do in the classroom. So I'm going to mute myself. I love listening to Robyn. I learn something every time. So thank you all for joining us today, and here we go.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. And you can skip it, Allison. After that introduction, there's nothing else to be said. So I just want a couple of things to start with. Number one, if I'm a little off my game today, I apologize in advance. We were talking off camera about the fact that my granddaughters were kind enough to give me a stomach bug, and I'm still kind of suffering through that. So I apologize in advance. As Kate said, I'm going to talk to you about some terminology, definitions, and the law, and kind of give you the framework for what's really important about today's program is Kate and Allison's presentation and how that impacts you in the classroom and in terms of your dealings with your students. But I just threw this slide in just so that everybody knows Friday is International Trans Day of Visibility. You can find resources at GLSEN. And basically what Trans Day of Visibility is just it's an awareness day. In November, on November 20th of every year, we have Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is a sad day because that's the day we remember everyone who died during the last 365 days because of their status as being trans or non-binary, usually as a result of murder and or taking their own lives. So the 31st is more of a day of celebration where we celebrate who we are. And you should know, as a disclaimer, I am a trans woman. So I come to the subject matter with a bit of a bias, but I am an out and proud trans woman. And so my journey, my life's experiences informs my work. And I always tell everybody that you should be aware of that. I also always disclaim and say, I'm not here to give anybody legal advice. I'm here to tell you what the law is. To the extent that you need legal advice, you could consult with your school board attorneys or your personal attorneys. I'll give you the framework and we can go from there. In terms of definitions, terminologies, a couple of things. Probably most of you already know all of this. So I may well be preaching to the choir. And again, to the extent I am, I apologize for that. But one thing I would caution everyone is that terminology and the terms that your students use are always evolving. Even those of us who work in the space of giving presentations and speaking on LGBTQ plus issues constantly need to educate ourselves and monitor what's going on, because everyone's language is different based on their age, based on their ethnicity, based on where they come from, geography. So listen to your students in terms of the terminology that they use and how they self-identify, because that's important. And be respectful of however they self-identify, even if it's not necessarily the terminology that I'm giving you or that you hear today. Be respectful of the students in terms of their own self-identity. So again, starting with the basics, LGBTQIA+, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual or ace. And the LGB, and sometimes the Q and sometimes the A, are deal with sexual orientation, who you're attracted to. The T in LGBTQIA, and sometimes the Q, which could stand for queer, genderqueer, is about gender identity. And what is gender identity? I think we all know what sexual orientation is. We all have a sexual orientation. We all can identify with that. We can all say, yes, I'm attracted to women. I'm a lesbian. I'm attracted to men. I'm heterosexual. I'm attracted to both. I'm bi. So we all kind of get the concept of sexual orientation, but not everybody gets the concept of gender identity. And it's because of the fact that gender identity is a deeply held sense.
Hey, sorry, I did not forget about you.
Okay.
Casey is available.
I'm sorry. Am I? Okay. If you're not muted, can you mute? Just because I was getting some language in the background. Gender identity is that deeply held knowledge of who you are, be that male, female, or somewhere on a spectrum that's neither male nor female. So that would be non-binary. And for trans people, their gender identity does not align with the sex that they were assigned at birth. For cisgender people, it does align. And so their gender identity and the sex that they were assigned at birth match. So there's two things that are in place there. I'm using the term sex assigned at birth because in terms of what we're talking about, we're not talking about biological sex, which is, I know, a term that a lot of people like to use and everything else, but sex assigned at birth is just that. When a baby is born, the doctor looks, or the doctor, the midwife, the nurse, whoever delivers the baby looks, and if there's a penis, they say to mom, congratulations, you have a little boy. If there's a vagina, they say, congratulations, you have a little girl. That's all sex assigned at birth is. It doesn't take in a myriad of other factors, including genetics. So I use the term sex assigned at birth, and you'll see that used in terms of when we talk about gender identity. For cisgender people, as I said, they're sex assigned at birth, and that deeply held knowledge of who they are, male or female, aligns. And so most cisgender people don't think about the concept of gender identity as being separate and apart from anything else. It's not something they're aware of. But everyone has a gender identity. Cisgender people, transgender people, non-binary people, everyone has a gender identity. The reason why cisgender people don't think of it is because it's not really part of your data set. You're just there. And so I know when I talk to people and I say, listen, tell me what makes you a man or a woman. And we'll leave out non-binary for right now. Tell me what makes you a man or a woman. Most people will default to their genitalia, and they'll say, this is who I am. And I said, no, you can't use genitalia. And they'd push back and say, why not? And my answer is always, well, let's suppose that a man had a horrible accident. And as a result of that accident, he lost his penis and testicles. When he woke up the next morning, he'd be horribly scarred, emotionally devastated, but he wouldn't say, oh my God, I'm a woman now. Because that's not his gender identity. So if I continue to push people and say, what makes you a man or a woman? And I say, you can't use genitalia. They say, I like this, I like that, I'm into this. Those are social stereotypes. That's all they are. That doesn't make you a man or a woman. I can find just as many men into sewing and cooking and what society says are female roles, and I can find just as many women into what would typically societal roles for men. And so, no, can't be that. What is it? I think if I kept pushing you, ultimately you would say, I don't know, Robyn, I just am. Hold on to that. The I don't know, I just am, that's your gender identity. And if you're cisgender, it matches what you were assigned at birth, the sex you were assigned at birth. If you're transgender, it doesn't match. And so that's what a transgender person is. Someone who's sex assigned at birth and their gender identity are not aligned. And I want to make it clear, I left out non-binary before. I'm going to go back to that. That when someone is non-binary, their gender identity is basically neither male or female or both male and female. So that's their gender identity. That's their deeply held knowledge of who they are. So that becomes important in a little bit when I kind of touch on the law and explain to you what New Jersey law protects against. A couple other things, definitions to talk about. We've talked about cisgender, we talked about transgender, we've talked about sex assigned at birth. Let's talk about something that you'll see the term transition, and transition is the shorthand for when someone goes from living in the sex that they were assigned at birth to going to live in accordance with their gender identity. Couple of things. And I should have said this at the outset. Maybe this is just because I'm not at 100%. No one chooses to be transgender, all right? Just like no one chooses to be gay, no one chooses to be bi, no one chooses to be straight. You just are. No one chooses to be transgender. I'm sure a lot of you have seen recently, across the country, things about transgenderism and transgender ideology and a transgender agenda and all those kinds of things. As somebody who's transgender, I'm here to tell you there is no such thing, right? We're human beings. I didn't ask to be this way. I was born this way. And I tell you that as a 70-year-old trans woman. And why is that important? Because when I was born in 1952, there was no internet, there was no, social media, there was nothing. But I knew from the age of 3 or 4 that I was a girl, all right? I didn't know how to express that. I couldn't tell that to anyone. In the 1950s, we didn't even talk about sex, no less, somebody being transgender. It was a concept that I didn't even know existed. I felt I was the only person in the world who felt like I did. And I tell you that not, as being an exhibitionist. I tell you that so that you can understand that when people say children are too young to know their gender identity, I will say, no, they're not. Not every trans person knows at the same time, and not every trans person is as definitive as I was. For some, it's a journey. For some, it takes time to figure out who they are. But I will tell you that for many transgender people, they know at a very young age. And so when you're dealing with your students, when you hear a student self-identify as trans or non-binary, and you're like, oh, they're too young to know that. No, they're not. All right, what you want to look for is someone who is insistent, consistent, and persistently saying, this is who I am. And if they're doing that, please listen to them. It's not a phase. It's not a fad. It's not something that they're going to grow out of. This is who they are. So I kind of segued off of the term transition. And just like everyone gets to their understanding of themselves in their own way, and some might know at a very young age, some might not know till later in life. There are as many transgender experiences as there are transgender people. But I tell you that, we see this word transition and it sounds like there's a roadmap that people have to follow. And the answer is no. There are as many ways to transition, or as I like to refer to it, as affirming your gender, as there are people who are seeking to affirm their gender. So, depending on where you are, how old you are, and what you want to do, that will define your individual transition. And I also want to make clear that not all transgender people transition. It's important for you to know that. I was just as much a transgender person at 50 before I went through the gender affirmation process as I was afterwards. All that someone affirming their gender does is it doesn't change them. It changes what everyone else knows about them. So if someone comes out if someone comes out to you, they're no different than they were the day before. They're still the same person. The only thing that's changed is what you know. So I think I've one other definition I won't just real quickly want to give you, and it's one that you don't see too much, is dead name. DEADNAME, dead name. Dead name is the person's name that they were assigned at birth, that after they go through the gender affirmation process, or even before, maybe they don't use anymore. And so keep that in mind. For some people, using their dead name can be very offensive, number one. It can be traumatizing, and it can get you in trouble. So that's what the term dead name means. We will talk about it a little bit as I go into the law, but again, be respectful of people. People don't have preferred pronouns. They have pronouns. People don't have necessarily chosen names. They have names. I understand that it gets a little hard when you're trying to distinguish between a name assigned at birth and the name the person uses, but New Jersey is a common law name change state, which means that you can change your name just by usage. So doesn't mean you can change your identity documents that way, but you can legally go by a different name just by using a different name. So those are names and pronouns. Let's talk a little bit about the law. And if I'm rushing a bit, I will just say that this is a program that I could do over the course of a day. So I realize that there's a little bit of a time constraint here. Let's talk a little bit about the law. We are in New Jersey, and in many ways, we are fortunate that we are in the state of New Jersey. Again, I don't have to tell you what's going on outside the state of New Jersey in terms of bills being passed, attacking the trans community, in particular, attacking the LGBTQ plus community writ large in terms of don't stay gay, and book bannings of books dealing with any subject that touch on LGBTQ plus issues. So, in that sense, we're in a little bit better space. But for anybody who doesn't think that things are happening in New Jersey, you're not reading the newspapers and you're not paying attention, because those things are starting to bubble up in New Jersey. And in that regard, we're a little bit better off because we do have some strong legal protections. The first of which is the New Jersey law against discrimination. Passed in 1945, the New Jersey law against discrimination bans discrimination in housing, places of public accommodation, and employment based on specific classifications. So the ones that you would generally think of: age, race, ethnicity, gender, ability or disability, those kinds of things. But in 1991, the statute was amended to prevent discrimination against people based on their sexual orientation. Yes, in 1991, New Jersey banned discrimination against people based on their sexual orientation in housing, employment, places of public accommodation. In 2007, it was amended again, and the 2007 amendments added gender identity to the list of protected classifications under the law against discrimination. So in New Jersey, it is against the law to discriminate against someone in housing, employment, and places of public accommodation based on their gender identity. So looping back before, I mentioned that someone being non-binary, that their gender identity is non-binary, they are protected under the New Jersey law against discrimination. So you don't have to be a trans man or a trans woman, and it is your gender identity, whatever that might be. So, as I said, in 2007, gender identity was added, and what is important to you in terms of your academic environments is places of public accommodation. Discrimination is banned in places of public accommodation. The statute specifically states that public schools, all public schools in the state of New Jersey are places of public accommodation. The statute further says that when, and I'm paraphrasing, but under the law, you're allowed to have sex segregated facilities. So men's rooms, ladies' rooms, men's locker rooms, ladies' locker rooms. The statute specifically provides that when you do have sex segregated facilities in places of public accommodation, that people are allowed to use those facilities in accordance with their gender identity. So again, in a school environment, when you have an issue over a transgender student wishing to use the bathroom in accordance with their gender identity, under the LAD, the Law Against Discrimination, they are protected and they must be allowed to use the facilities in accordance with their gender identity. So, that is spelled out directly in the Law Against Discrimination. Same for locker rooms. Again, school facilities, locker rooms, you're allowed to use them in accordance with your gender identity. Let me again very quickly dispel some myths based on, number one, my own personal experience, but my experience dealing with and talking to trans people. The person that is the most nervous person in the bathroom is the trans person. They don't want any problems. They're not there looking for anything. There's this false equivalency that's been created that somehow, and in particular, trans women are sexual predators. In New Jersey, since 2007, people have been allowed to use bathrooms and locker rooms in accordance with their gender identity. There has not been a spike in sexual assaults in bathrooms caused by transgender people, because transgender people are not sexual predators. That's a false equivalency. If a sexual predator went into a bathroom, that person should be arrested. But because someone's transgender doesn't make them a sexual predator. So I say that again, so that you understand that some of the things that are being circulated in terms of bathrooms, locker rooms, transgender people trying to invade women's only spaces. I mean, again, I only have one lived experience. I've only had one life, but I can tell you based on my life and based on the people I know that it's simply not an accurate recitation of how we feel. In addition to the Law Against Discrimination of particular relevance to all of you, is in 2018, the Department of Education came down with transgender guidance. And that deals with many questions in terms of how students should be treated, transgender students should be treated in public schools. And I know that the phrase transgender guidance has led some people to say, oh, it's guidance. We don't have to follow that. And that's, again, I am not giving legal advice, but I'm telling you as a lawyer and as an advocate, I believe that's an incorrect position, because the transgender guidance was created as a result of a statute signed into law under the Christie administration, which required the Department of Education and mandated the Department of Education to come up with guidance on to how to deal with these issues, and specifically told the Department of Education which issues to deal with. So from my position, the transgender guidance has the same force and effect as a statute, as law, and should be followed accordingly. The transgender guidance, we don't have time to go through it in detail because I know my time is almost up, but let me just give you some highlights. Number one, it is student-centered. So it's important for you to understand that there is no magic formula that, you have to check off boxes for a student to be considered transgender or non-binary. If the student tells you that this is how they identify, it's a student-centered approach, you follow that approach. unless you have some reason to believe that it's being done for some untoward purpose. But again, I haven't heard stories or seen any evidence that that is happening. And so I just tell you that it's student-centered. It also, if the student says, my parents don't know, please don't tell them, that request shall be honored, right? Again, that is in the guidance. Now, we all know from a reality standpoint that if student, who parents know as John, is coming to school and identifies as Mary and is dressing as Mary in school and using facilities in accordance with her gender identity, that word will get back ultimately to mom and dad. So there has to be a conversation with the student about the ramifications of not telling mom and dad, but that request by the student has to be honored. The student doesn't have to have a court-ordered name change. You should honor their pronouns and names on all internal school documents, as well as with all testing records. Again, that's part of the guidance. The guidance provides for, as I said, confidentiality, not only if they request it with the parents, but only people in the school who have reason to know should be told. The student's right to privacy should be respected. The other thing that the guidance provides is that students, again, in terms of extracurricular activities, class trips, things of that nature, are to be treated in accordance with their gender identity. Which kind of gets me to my last topic before I turn it over to Allison and Kate, unless they have something else that they want me to cover, which is student athletes, which, again, I will touch on very briefly. I've done whole programs on this, but the NJSIAA, which is the governing body for public school high schools, well, not only public, but parochial high school sports as well in the state of New Jersey, in 2007, issued a policy that said that transgender students could participate in high school sports in accordance with their gender identity. That was subsequently refined in 2017. And in 2021, they added some, not necessarily to the policy, but to their frequently asked questions section in terms of how non-binary students would be treated. So again, that's readily available on the NJSIAA website. And since 2007, that policy has been in place. Unless you're a high school coach or a high school athletic director, probably I would wager a guess 95% of you could not name a transgender athlete in the state of New Jersey. So despite the hue and cry about what's going to happen to girls' sports and people are going to lose scholarships and everything else, there's not one transgender athlete that most people can name. And so again, I think it's a solution in search of a problem when people say that trans, and in particular trans girls, should not be allowed to participate in high school sports in accordance with their gender identity. I will get up on my soapbox and then I will step down. In this country, I think we have lost track of what's important about high school sports. And people have made it about scholarships and about becoming a professional athlete. And really, when you look at things, about 2% of high school athletes get a college scholarship, and about 0.0075, I think it is, ultimately go on to play professional sports. So, we're not focusing on the right thing. High school sports are supposed to be educational. They're supposed to be fun. They're supposed to be about teaching kids to enjoy and become part of a team and be part of a group and achieve something and grow confidence in themselves. And it's part of the education process. And we've lost sight of that. And so when people, harangue about trans kids participating in sports, I just say, hey, we're talking about high school sports, we're talking about middle school sports. You've lost track of what's important. I'll leave you with this, and I know that Kate and Allison will certainly pick up on this theme, but it is so important for you to be affirming to your trans and non-binary students. I don't have to tell you folks the rate of suicide ideology in terms of the trans population. I've seen north of 40%, and yet that almost disappears when the child has someone in their life, be that a teacher, an administrator, a coach, who is affirming of them, who listens to them, who accepts them as who they are. Hopefully the student is getting that at home, but if they're not, you play such a critical role. And I just ask you to be there for your LGBTQ plus students, and in particular for your trans students. So unless Kate and Allison have anything else that they want me to touch on, I'll turn it over to them and to the most important part of the program.
Not right now. Thank you, Robyn. But if you're staying on the host side with us, jump in at any point to underline some of the things that we're going to be talking about in the classroom.
I also just want to shamelessly plug Robyn as well, because I believe that there's some administrators online here. And I know in the past, and I'm hoping again in the future, Robyn does fabulous programming with David Nash through Legal One. So if you're looking for administrative level guidance on this sort of stuff and, more time with Robyn, that is a great place to get it.
All right. So we're gonna pick it up and bring some of this stuff into the classroom. Allison and I have done this little Texas two-step together a bunch of times, and every time we're trying to create an experience for all of you that's a little it's relevant in the moment, but it's hard for us to not give some foundation that you might have heard in other places, and so at the beginning of this we're going to be reminding you of some information that is important for you to perhaps look up on your own. So, we're not going to take you through the stats necessarily this time, but you can go read them. And it's critical that you do to start taking putting an empirical frame on the youth that we're dealing with. We also want to put this in the perspective of personal practice. I'm a 26-year classroom teacher. I am running art classes outside of school. I'm working with young people outside of the terrestrial school day. I'm a mom to an 18-year-old who's in the Garfield costume in the middle of this picture here. He's kind of a little weird. I love him dearly. But the point of me kind of putting these things out here is that we're whole people ourselves before we even walk into the classroom. And that goes for everyone here. Before you walk into the school, building, classroom, you're a whole person bringing an entire shaped, lived experience with you into that space. And so is every one of the young people that you're working with. They have things, they don't have things. They are well-adjusted. They are perhaps self-harming. We don't know what kids are coming in the classroom until we do know. There's just the biggest boatload out there of what we don't know. And so the perspective that Allison and I take, and certainly in conjunction with legal leadership like Robyn's, is that we're trying to create a public education system that is operating, meeting our student learning standards, doing all the things we're supposed to do, but is the best, most inclusive, affirming, safe space for all of our students, because we don't know what we don't know about them. And so, I come to this as somebody who, like, the one picture here, I work with rescue dogs, right? I have my own rescue dog. Like, here are things that can't even speak for themselves, and I'm all about it. I'm your bleeding heart. And that's kind of how I come at this. So Allison, your slide. Allison's slide. So I gotta like wave at her to do her slides.
Yeah, so no, it's just serious. And I tried to put the same thing together as Kate, because I do think it's important that we come at this as whole people. Probably the most important picture for me in this one is that bottom right for me, which is my two children. This work has always been deeply personal to me in the sense of taking care of the students who came into my classroom and taking care of people that I know and love, and taking care of people who have not been allowed to use their own voices to take care of themselves. But it comes to my doorstep and into my home with those two in the bottom right. So, it's near and dear, and it covers every aspect of life. My husband is a big part of this work as well, and he does it in his own. We're both exceptionally politically active, because sometimes you have to put your money where your mouth is, both literally and figuratively. We travel a lot, but even that's changed for us because of the demographics of my family right now. We're very careful about where we go. And I, of course, did put in my own rescue dog, Molly, who is my ride or die, as well as the cat who runs my house, just so you can see them. But again, a veteran educator who spent a lot of time with this, and I am not doing this to pump them up, but they should be. A lot of this work does stem from my time at Kane. I have 30 credits towards a second master's in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and the focus on language and othering, and all the lessons that really do come with studies in genocide are one of the things that really kind of brought me to this work, because it's a larger focus on how we treat people differently, and how when we do that, we do them harm. And I think very similarly to those in the medical field, I think everybody in the education field comes to this with an aspect of, let's do no harm.
When we're in person, this works a little bit differently. We're going to share with you, and the slide deck will go out to all our participants later as well. But we like to make some assumptions for this space. We don't have the time to build a community agreement together over the period of such a short talk. So we have to go from the place that we're making assumptions. And above all, we know we're touching on things that you're opting into here, but these are complex. These are challenging things that we're dealing with in the moment, perhaps because of the political piece, perhaps because of the interpersonal part. And at many times we'd rather not talk about them and just get about teaching, right? Just doing our teaching. We have to necessarily expand what the definition of teaching is. And as a result, we have to make some assumptions about how we're going to address each other and work in this space. We are well-intentioned, we're good people, and we want to see our students succeed. And so that's how we're moving forward with this. Another piece of this, Alice will talk about the kind of agreements that we have.
But before I go past the slide, the other thing I'm going to say to you all very, very quickly, I do a lot of DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion work. It's part of my job. And one of the most important things that I think that I've heard recently is the importance of looking forward. I think a lot of times when teachers start to reflect on their practice and we start to think about how we can evolve that practice to be more inclusive, we realize that we have in fact made mistakes in the past. That's human. It's normal that we're going to do that. What is important is now that we know what those mistakes are, we don't make them again. It's the whole when you know better, do better idea. But there is no point in focusing on what's behind us to move forward and to progress. We have to remember to look at what's forward. And I think that's a really important reminder. Part of when you do this kind of work, it's important to kind of have norms, and we'll talk more about establishing norms in your own classrooms to maintain inclusivity and those safe, brave spaces that we really like. But the 4 agreements that are commonly referred to are this idea of staying engaged. Please stay involved with us. You can ask questions in the chat. I believe Sarah's monitoring that, and we're going to leave time for Q&A at the end. So stay engaged, write your questions down, share them with us. We will answer them. And if we can't answer them, we will get back to you with an answer, because we're good like that. Everything about this work, whether it's around queer inclusive policy and practice, or if it's about anything related to the larger scope of inclusivity and DEI, you're going to be uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable work, but that's important, because where we find growth is in that discomfort. Absolutely speak your truth. If you choose to share stuff with us or in other spaces around this work, speak your truth, but remember to do it in I statements, because your experience, much like Robyn said, is one experience, and there are lots of other experiences. And a lot of times we don't get that closure that we're looking for. And that's important to remember. This is a work in progress. We're all work in progresses, but this work itself is also a work in progress.
So this is kind of an overview of things that we're going to be touching on, our kind of objectives. As I'd said at the outset, the outcomes that inform our work are the fact that the sort of structural inequities that are in place, especially around queer and trans kids, kill them, harm them, remove them from public education, reduce their positive educational outcomes, restrict longitudinal successes. There's absolutely no way to say it that is gentle. And there are decades of data that tell us that affirming and inclusive practices, well-educated and positive intention in the classroom ameliorate those negative outcomes. And so you can look it up. We'll tell you where to go look at the GLSEN, every other year survey, for instance. But that's what we're looking at first, right? We want to keep kids in school in order for young people to experience successes in whatever they choose to do post-secondarily, perhaps. They need to have positive experiences leading up to that point. They may not always be in school. They may be school adjacent, but if they don't come to school, we know that correlates with lower achievement in school, whether it's represented through test scores, GPA, and that's because they're coming to school less. Right? That's because they're not participating and engaging as much as their straight and cisgender peers. And so we have to make sure that we're attending to all of these things as a function of free, accessible, appropriate education that all of our students are guaranteed.
And also to piggyback off of that, but to what Robyn was saying, that one adult can make all the difference in the world. That if you look at the GLSEN report, and not all of us have time to go through the hundreds of pages, the executive summary can be super informative as well. But the impact of one adult can completely disrupt that entire situation. And the data proves that. Like, it's not just a feel-good story. The data absolutely supports the impact of one affirming adult in these situations. So please do not underestimate the power that you have in your own classroom.
And we're going to be talking a little bit about these pedagogies, but we're not going to be fancy about the particular educational philosophy. We're going to talk about our own practice, and we're going to share some examples from lessons, from experiences that we've had in classrooms. What does it mean for schools, and what does it mean for sort of each age and grade level? And to that, I want to open this up. So this is turning around in your brain as we go through the next half hour or so. A large percent of students in front of you identify as LGBTQAI+. We're looking at this particular generation that we're working with, especially those that are middle school to high school generation. Roughly 16.9% of those students identify somewhere in that gender, everything from transgender, non-binary, genderqueer, to their sexual orientation, LGBTQAI, and some other cultural language that falls around certain sexual orientation. We also see this as expressed as, SOGI, right? Their sexual orientation and gender identity data, which we can't collect on young people. So there's that. And so we're looking at a huge number of students in front of us that some may be, but largely are not telling us who they are. So the impact that our global pedagogy has on the students in our classroom cannot be understated. And, this is something that when you look at it is going to be, is it a lesson, which we'll talk about? Is it materials? Is it an environment? We have to say yes, right? It's all of these things. And we have to think about what that means in a much more global perspective. If you are here today with somebody else from your building or district, we have to start considering what this looks like as a crosswalk. I recently called Allison my living crosswalk because she is across all grade levels, right? The approach is never about a singular set of people who we identify as our heroes. Our queer heroes or trans heroes, although that is important, but it is about that they may get maybe only in 10th grade, but it is about where the messages around affirmation and inclusivity are embedded in each year, in each topic of a youth's educational career. Stop moving it make it less about me teaching high school art, right? And being the sort of Bill Murray and Groundhog Day, right? Everything's the same. And instead, we have to move to that student-centered point, which is they have a 13-year career in public education from pre-K to 12. and more if they're students with extended school for because they're student disabilities or something like that. And we have to recognize that this applies to all populations in our school. Our content area needs come out of understanding what our pedagogies are. And how do we find people to do this transformative work with in our own building and district? And certainly moving ourselves to intent that is positive, right? There is so much about this work. We're going to talk about the places that this intersects with other representative curricula and other mandates in the state of New Jersey. We have to end deficit thinking, right? This is not, this is the point that Allison made about what was done, and we have to be thinking forward. The mistakes I've made in 26 years, hoy. However, I have to be looking forward to the next one, the next opportunity, and taking that that chance with my young people to put something new into practice that affects them, but they then affect our futures, right? And we're always paying it forward.
And then, of course, we'll have time for questions and answers.
Plenty.
And just so you know, we do this whole back and forth thing this whole time. So I'm really sorry if you find that format annoying, but it kind of works for us.
So all of our work is proactive, right? If we know that we're in a moment of reaction because, and here's how I know, we're reacting because our higher ed does not make you as educators take gender studies as a requirement to become a teacher in the state of New Jersey. It does not require courses, except for one college, I believe, does not require any courses on any of these mandates, even though most of you will have to touch on them at some point in your educational career. So that's why we know that we're in a reactive moment, and we have to move that, right? The work in the classroom is taking it from that place to a proactive place. And as Robyn had said before, and a lot of us are feeling in the moment, inclusive work is not about politics, it's about kids. But yes, it took an act of legislature to make this a reality for a lot of us. We are lucky, I believe we are lucky that that's what the people who represent us in elected government will do for public schools. It does tell us a little bit about the kind of the way small districts may work, or districts work, as with home rule, and we're seeing that in terms of kinds of pushback around the state. So we have to lean into the things that are there for us, that uphold what we want to see as the outcomes for our students, for our schools, for the curriculum that we're doing. And we have to use that then, right? This sense that we're going to be proactive to turn that lens back on our own work and kind of do an audit, right? We have to be able to examine what we're upholding and reinforcing currently and what we want to change. These are tremendously huge asks of even a teaching team or a school, let alone doing it on an individual basis, right? We have to say, what didn't I get as a teacher in preparation? What didn't I have as a young scholar that I want to move into a place of practice in my classroom? So we have to kind of think about what it means to interrupt these old ways, right? This disruption model that Allison and I love, like, we love it. Go be a badass, right? You need to disrupt a lot of this old stuff. It doesn't mean throw it out. We have plenty that is great, that is good, that is working. But we have to disrupt those places where we unknowingly accept a format, accept language, accept texts, accept a structure that disenfranchises or maintains a marginalization, especially for our LGBTQAI kids. But this is the interruption piece, continues to model that for those that are not LGBTQAI. So we can't uphold those systems and continue training our next generation that upholding these systems are okay.
And I think it's most important. One of the most dangerous phrases in the world is, this is the way it's always done, right? And we're not in a position right now to blow up schools and start from scratch. So this work is really grassroots level work. And I think when we use the word mandate, it becomes particularly problematic because it's there's just something about language. I'm a sucker for language. And, you know, as important as this is, when we say mandate, I think teachers immediately just think like, there's just one more thing that I have to do. And even for administrators as well, and education has just been so much over the past couple of years. And one of the things that I'm finding in my work and in my research is that even when teachers want to do this work, they do it to the best of their ability, and then something else gets put on their plate and this falls to the wayside. And I think one of the things that we're trying to drive home here is that this is something that cannot fall by the wayside. You know, all of our students in our classrooms deserve to be seen and heard and affirmed. And there's so many different benefits to that go way beyond state testing and data, but goes to this idea of creating safe, happy, and healthy students who thrive and live, which is really also the ultimate goal here. And part of also being proactive in this age of things that are not supposed to be about politics, but are. I just a shout out to lesson plans. Like, for whatever you do here, just make sure it's codified in your lesson plans, right? Because there is going to be pushback, and I'm knocking wood right now. I am in a district where the pushback is currently minimal, but I know that a lot of my friends and colleagues in other districts are not so lucky. And one of the very first ways that any teacher can really make sure that they do this work with support is by putting it in their lesson plan, so that nobody is caught off guard. You know, that today was your DEI lesson, today was your, you know, today you included this, so that when the parent phone call comes in or the adult phone call comes in, you have that backed up. And that's part of that being proactive, as well as anticipating obstacles, challenges, pushbacks. And that way you can be prepared when you have that conversation in the classroom or with an adult who might not be so happy with your lesson planning.
So we like to take the approach that you create your own environment of inclusion. You alone in your classroom, your team of teachers, ICS teacher or ICR teacher and lead teacher in your building, in your hallway. And at the base of this, and Allison and I have talked about this now for a number of years, the unfunded mandate portion of this is probably one of the most, larger challenges around sustainable practices, right? Because we're trying to find a quote unquote easy way or a quote unquote streamlined way to push in on this, but we're not really evaluating what that looks like beyond a one-time only use. And so we're here advocating for thoughtful, methodical, and sustainable practices. Certainly what that looks like are small changes that have lasting effect, right? We always know that like building habits, right, is a hard thing. You want to change an eating habit, an exercise habit, et cetera. And I say this as a habit resistant person. These are huge challenges. So what's sustainable, right? Sustainable are those classroom practices around, I'm always going to audit my book lists, my text lists, because it's part of my practice to make sure something is current. And I do that annually. I can add an additional question or lens about authorship that I'm representing, geography that I'm representing. Perhaps with my art history classes, I'm thinking about representation of new writing and thinking around gender identity. So I have a set of questions. Now this is sustainable because it's part of my regular practice for a class. It's not just because of the mandate. Establishing norms is part of that environment of inclusion. This helped, we have to evaluate our own language, which was a great piece of this that Robyn gifted us today, thinking about our language in the classroom, changing the way that we speak to students. I'm sure a number of you have heard about that, but I greet my students, hey friends, all the time. I've removed almost all gendered references unless it's a student who's asking me to specifically refer to them with a particular gendered pronoun. But in my group, speech, I've removed that. Some people use young scholars, poets, artists, etc. And I talk to mine as friends. I'm like, hey friends, hey first period friends, whatever it is.
I'm going to interrupt you today too, because Robyn also brought up the evolution of language. Robyn, we're just going to keep coming back to you, just so you know. But Robyn also brought up the evolution of language, and apparently one of the big controversies right now is the use of the words friends. I'm also a friends person. I agree, everybody is friends. I think half my emails even go out as, to friends as my colleagues. But there's this pushback against that term because teachers are not supposed to be students' friends. I've been at this for 20 some odd years now. So as far as I'm concerned, that can go shove, but I understand, especially for maybe younger teachers, new service teachers, that language might be problematic. So, the non-gender terms are hugely important, but, the friends thing is apparently coming under fire. I feel like everything is going to come under fire at some point, but it is important to come up. I mean, I also went the route of like going with seasonal things, pumpkins, turkeys, all sorts of things. So, and the kids, especially if you teach high school, really love it when you come up with these strange terms of endearment, but also with language. And I'm going to kind of piggyback off of Kate really quick. I just want to, your students are not going to buy in to anything you're doing in your classroom, no matter how great your book lists are, how wonderfully sourced your resources are, any of that, if you don't monitor the language being used in your classroom. So I just want to remind you that it's not just your language, but it's the language that you allow in those side conversations when people are coming into the classroom, all of those things, that's part of creating that sustainable classroom. It's part of being supportive and affirmative. If you hear somebody say something that is racist, biased, discriminatory, you need to stop it immediately. You need to make sure that your norms are such that you can say, hey, that's not what we do here, and this is why, because none of the rest of it's going to land if the actual space itself is no good.
Can I just interject? I mean, because I know we're talking to teachers, administrators here, but this is an issue that even as a lawyer, we're facing. The New Jersey judiciary issued a policy trying to remove gendered terms. So for somebody who's been practicing law for 45 years, it's no longer appropriate to say ladies and gentlemen of the jury. It's, the jury. And it's no longer, Ms. Gigl, it's Attorney Gigl, which again is trying to meet people where they are and not make assumptions that might be incorrect. Yeah. I had to respond to an email today from somebody from the courts, and her first name or their first name happened to be Robyn, Robin. Now, Robyn could be a male name, it could be. And so, my initial reaction is, dear, oh, what do I say? And so I just took her title and I used her title. And so I just want to tell people that this is not just something that's happening in classrooms and schools and in education. It's happening in a lot of environments because we do want to be sensitive and meet people where they are.
There's a tremendous amplification effect that has, right? So what one teacher is affirming or one teacher is not affirming and doesn't get on board. And we know how young people speak to each other and sort of what that does, right? You have street cred in school, whether you know it or are in touch with it or not. And the students are responsible for communicating with each other, population. And that can get in the way of that work that Allison was talking about, right? The sort of, I'll say the authenticity, but there's a fidelity through it too. An environment of inclusion is also supportive and affirming of all students, right? So this is about not just physical or visual representations, right? But is an understanding in the same way that those of us that address, say, an IEP that puts a kid in the desk closest to the board for vision or attention concerns. What about kids that need support of something, or we know that they need physical access to a different part of the room, or they're the doodler, right? Our understanding of who the whole child is, this supportive and affirming understanding of how we would set up a classroom extends to things that are not always visible because it's a flag or a poster or a book. Although flags and posters and books, while being challenged in some districts in New Jersey, are super awesome ways to show that you have a vocabulary, a personal vocabulary and vision that extends beyond what you see in front of you in that moment. And so for an example, here's a great classroom practice. I worked with a teacher that wanted to create an inclusive environment. They had lots of choice books. They were not a primarily English teacher. But what they had done is collected and created a classroom library over several years. And their one policy was, you're going to read the rainbow during the year. All of their books, instead of like Crazy Dewey Decimal, were instead colored masking tape on them that represented sports, biography, nature. They had arts, they had history, and they created their own classification system inside of each of these categories. Inclusive, based on certain gender identity, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, religion, etc. And they had created a way, an easy matrix for the kids, took them time in preparation, but what a wonderful way to provide opportunities for visibility with it being a sort of natural, sustainable, right, normative part of the classroom. It was a great solution. The kid before the end of the year had to read from each color category. Boom, they'd done some pretty cool stuff. And the last piece on here, the environment of inclusion is one of self-determination. We accept our kids for who they say they are. I am one of the things that happens to me time and time again is that I accept the kid that comes in my room. I have this person, initials are LG. They're coming in, they're doing this, they're making a great painting. I run into their parent at a service event after school and they introduce themselves. Oh, you have so-and-so. And I'm like, who? Because I don't know that young person by that name or that. And I recover really quite quickly. And this shows me the other challenge, right? The outside of the classroom challenge of the student telling me who they are, and I accept that. Easy in the classroom. One of the biggest sort of rough roads is taking that outside into the rest of the school day. And I'm sure that Allison is going to talk a little bit about one of our favorite resources for working with students through some of that.
I am.
I hope we're all familiar with windows, mirrors, sliding glass doors. I'm going to let Allison handle these next couple of slides.
And I just to Kate's point really quick, and we can talk gender support plans in a couple of minutes, but I just want to remind everybody, and I think Robyn touched on it before too, when we have students who feel safe and comfortable enough with us to be their true and genuine selves, and they articulate to us that this is not something that they are sharing at home, it's super important that we make note of that and do it however you can. In my district, we have notes in our Genesis program, and we know if it's affirmed at home or not affirmed at home, and that's great for us. But a lot of teachers have taken other practices of putting it, in places so that they know when they have to call home not to do it, because it's an important reminder. The flip side of that being, if a student's in the process of changing documentation or things like that, make sure in your own classroom that your seating charts and things like that are up to date and they reflect who that student is. It's a small step, but hugely affirming, so that in your absence, a student is not called by a name that they don't identify with or things like that. So just something to think about. If you are not familiar with the work of Rudine Sims Bishop, it's amazing. It's amazing work that has to do primarily in this case with Black children's experiences of literature, but we have used it to really pan out to any group that doesn't typically get to see themselves reflected in different ways. And so there's this idea of a mirror, something that reflects, a window, something you can see through, and a sliding glass door, something that you have the opportunity to walk through and have it be transformational. So when we talk about mirrors, this. And I want to be clear that this whole system benefits not only our queer students, but also the people who don't understand what that experience is. When we provide these sorts of resources and these sorts of lessons, it's almost as valuable to the people who are not part of that community as it is to those who are part of it, because it builds empathy and understanding as well. But when we talk about mirrors, we're talking about this idea that our curriculum is going to be exceptionally, exceptionally inclusive, that it's going to validate experiences, it reinforces self-worth. And the more we talk about this lens of joy and celebration, that's exceptionally important, because if all you know is difficulty and, problems that you've been facing, and if the history is about the bad things and you never get to see the good, if you are struggling personally, it kind of reinforces this idea that there will never be joy, or there'll never be accomplishment or success. So seeing things that provide value, self-worth, success, and things like that, it provides a space for voices and discussion around these topics, and also promotes this idea of inclusion, because, I'm a history teacher. Everything comes to me, through that lens, and pretty much every mandate that's been created in the past bunch of decades landed firmly in a history classroom. And so we have seen this constant evolution of history from more and more wider lens, so we can tell a complete or a whole story. And that's really what this is. When we talk about windows, this is like the next step, right? Because again, it's just going to benefit all students and exposing them to true and accurate accounts. Again, keeping politics out of it, our classrooms and our resources are an opportunity really for us to show students accurate and true portrayals of groups that might be being somehow misrepresented in the media. And if they don't have another voice to sort of upend those false ideas of a population, what are they being left with? So in school, being able to expose them to more accurate and inclusive accounts of these communities. And also, again, there's that sense of empathy that develops when we have a better understanding of LGBTQ people. I always, the most incredible thing I could ever say to my students was, you don't have to have the same political opinions as your adults. They would just look at me like that was mind-blowing to them. Like, you don't have to share their opinion. You are allowed to develop your own opinion. But we have to be really careful in this environment about how we curate that. I kept a very neutral stance, and that was difficult for me. I mean, if you Google me, you know exactly where I stand on everything, because I've held public office and my students were high school students and advanced high school students at that. So they did it all the time. But they also told me that being in my classroom was a place where they all felt comfortable, regardless of their opinions, to talk them out and to come around to them. And so those windows do allow students an opportunity to question stereotypes, their own hidden or implicit biases about certain groups of people. And that's probably one of the most valuable things that we can do. And then that, of course, promotes, again, acceptance. And I'm going to say it again, empathy. Kate, I'll toss it over to you.
Okay. One of the things that I want to address is that the queer and disabilities education mandate is something that is not only in history or social studies.
It's not.
And so when we talk about accurate representations historically, history impacts all of our content areas, right? It's not that as a result of calculus, we're looking necessarily at the history of calculus, but we could develop an interesting view based on who the quote unquote famous mathematicians are and what they looked like. And we might end up having a really great conversation about that and who's represented and who's not from what parts of the world. Neil deGrasse Tyson has some great stuff on that stuff too. So we have to have this kind of expansive view, and that should help move us to this place. What does this look like in practice in your content area? Filling in the blank at your grade level, with your teaching team, with the particular students you have this year or this semester, or, in the morning, because we know what kids are like around 8 a.m. and the difference at 2 p.m. What does it look like in practice is going to be a moving target, is going to be something that shifts on you probably all year long. A great place for us to start is to think about one lesson in 1 year of our practice, right? One activity in 1 year of our practice, if we're starting, and having a full conversation, a full investigation of who it's intended for, and is that intended inclusive approach going to be sustainable? And so, some of the things that I like to think about are, how do I do this with fidelity in a high school art room? So we're taking it beyond heroes and holidays, and I'm not undercutting and saying that's not a good approach. The sort of June is Pride Month, October is LGBTQ History Month. We celebrate a person, we highlight them, but when you get into that, how deep are we talking about that person's identity and what it has done or impacted their contributions to society? We tend to work together to say that these have great, help us set great foundations. However, we need to move into that transformational space, the place that is, when we think about Bloom, perhaps, it's about synthesis. We're talking about adapting and adopting new ideas and what we make new with that. So ways to look at that are, what kind of products are your students making? What is the assignment have them create that they have to embed a new way of thinking or assimilate new information that challenges or investigates or puts a lens on SOGI-based information. I'll give an example. I did a project a year ago, about a year and a half ago, with high school students. They were sophomores and juniors in what was considered an advanced art class. But to give you context, it's not based on drawing skill. It's a conceptual art class. It's a little bit academic. And we were studying wayfinding, which is the system of signs and symbols that help you navigate spaces, right? So we think about airports or hospitals are two great ways. How do signs help you get around? And we talk about things that look like signs, right? That are letters and numbers on placards, and also signs that are less visible, color, shape of buildings, and how it moves you around it. And we were talking about the very antiquated part of our school building and whether people with disabilities could navigate our school. We were talking about wayfinding that's appropriate for the entire stakeholdership of our community to access the school building. And I had done this in the context, thinking about the mandate, doing it in the context of persons with disabilities and their contributions to our navigating public spaces. I had given my students, we found a couple apps that simulate different types of visibility, blindness, partial blindness, or other eye impediments. And they had a persona and they had to navigate our school building based on being this person having to do a particular task. They were given 45 minutes to do so. They came back after 12 and said, we can't do this. This place wasn't built for people that had sighted issues or had these particular disabilities. And this is the thing, as we came back together as a group and discussed this experience, this kind of lab that I had set up, what they went on to ask and then discover on their own is that the building wasn't inclusive based on gender identity. The notion of public space, these public locations, predetermined who the public was thought to be based on an old model. And I got them to that place through a particular experiment that in the outset had nothing to do with gender identity or sexual orientation, yet I met the mandate. It was an interesting lesson, and it's had a huge impact on their thinking about the spaces that they're in going forward. And so we have to think expansively. Am I teaching gay or trans people, or am I talking about representation, visibility, and the place within society that has not been granted a visible platform or acknowledgement or a chance to be excellent and joyful in our culture and community? Excuse me. Right? So here
And by
I
the
am.
way,
I'm talking at all you.
yeah.
And so that's what we call the spirit of the mandate as opposed to the letter of the mandate.
And
right?
I want to give another example of that, because again, I'm in this really cool place where I have this equity coaching job, but also where people are entertaining me and allowing me to ask questions and work with them around preliminary research for my dissertation. And I'm lucky that I relate super well with both teachers and admin in my district. And one of the conversations that came up lately was an administrator who was talking to me about how they worked with their team in an effort to make this mandate in particular seem less like a mandate and more like something that was designed to expand their curriculum, give them an opportunity to cull and change books in their libraries, to look at their curriculum and maybe update them with different things, and really made it an adventure, which I think very much helped their departments get behind this. But at the same time, we had a conversation about how they were disappointed when teachers wanted to continue to use To Kill a Mockingbird with regards to the mandate, because they didn't think that it really fit. They felt like it was being a forced conversation, but the teachers really made this argument for the conversation around gender roles and how those gender roles are traditional gender roles are challenged in this novel, and like develop it that way. And this supervisor thought that was a bad fit. It's not. It's a fabulous fit, right? Like it doesn't, like Kate's been saying, it doesn't have to be explicitly like, here's today's gay lesson. There's this whole spirit to the mandate that's just meant to be more inclusive in our language and our conversation and the things that we're doing. It's this mandate in particular. Again, we're looking at such full plates. I have a feeling that a lot of you are doing this already in your lessons, that you can probably look at what you're doing and realize that you are already doing it. Or you can look at lessons and see places where it organically fits to expand the conversation a little bit. I think I have a colleague on here, and a lesson that they did at the middle school history level is in my head this year. That was just a very organic extension that fit in just perfectly, right? So our work is already there, and it's natural, and it's meant to just sort of expand the view of what we're doing. Sorry, Kate, go ahead.
No, it's good. Just go. We're gonna have to kind of jump around on some of these slides. I just looked at the time.
Okay.
We're kind of sorry, not sorry. So,
do you want me to scoop, or?
Yeah, you can skip this one. I'll keep going two forward.
One more, or this one? Okay.
This is good for a second. I want to state that, like, this is a piece about this deficit thinking, right? Like, if we apply this through our histories, our queer and trans histories only started in 1969. If we only ground it in rising up against something, we never really get to tell people what we're for, right? And we have to move, and we see a lot of language around us that is about protecting trans lives, right? There are lives that are in danger. In the classroom, we have an opportunity to transform that to, here are the beautiful, joyful things that have been contributed to our culture, to everything from state parks, really cool stuff, right? When I start to think about joy, I look at national parks has a outdoors for all, right? If we start looking at the places that joy is reflected around us, we have opportunity to bring that and connect that into the classroom. Our narratives, unfortunately, negative narratives also give like a start date to somebody's identity. And I loved like Robyn's point earlier that like transition and coming out and that sort of moment or declaration is only about what we are learning about somebody. It's not that they never were before that. We have to take that same approach in the classroom. It's not that there's a start date on particular histories or movements, but how were they present and how are we investigating and looking for that presence across our content areas and materials, right?
I also just want to pop on and say, like, this is going to go back to the mental health thing too. Like, if we continue to look at these histories through a lens of struggle and despair, it doesn't help the mental health issues or all the other things that GLSEN tells us that our LGBTQ students are dealing with. So when we show them this opportunity for celebration, it shifts that lens for them. It's just so much of what we do is an onion, and it hits so many different levels. This is not just about the queer inclusive curriculum either. It's about all of the mandates that we're doing. And one of the conversations Kate and I had recently is that when I went into Black History Month, you know, again, we love this. We go down nerdy rabbit holes all the time. So when we hit Black History Month, I wanted the same concept, right? Like, it seems that Black History Month is constantly taught to us through a lens of either like slavery or civil rights. And I just wanted something different. And I wanted to make sure it was something celebratory and something that a lot of different students could see their identities in, and we could have this conversation. So I actually, and I'm also going to give a shout out because I think at least one of them is here as well. I work with my elementary school librarians a lot to vet sources and things like that. And I landed on a book called Shirley Chisholm is a Verb. And I ended up teaching about Shirley Chisholm in all these elementary school classes. And it was such a fabulous book because it hit so many different things. First of all, it was a celebration of a woman achieving all of these really incredible roles and being a first in those places, but also a conversation around gender roles because men were not happy to see her in those roles, and how many different glass ceilings that she had to crash. But she was also an immigrant. She was multilingual. She spent time separated from her family while they lived in one country and she lived in another. It opened up so many doors for conversations with little kids. And by the way, if any of you are elementary school teachers on here, like, you have, I so glad I taught high school because they're lovely, but they have a lot of questions and a lot of energy. But it was just a wonderful kind of example of what this is supposed to look like when we shift that lens and that intersectionality that can also make this so much more rewarding and important when we talk about it.
And that gives us the opportunity then to talk about joy, right? We get to talk about an accomplishment after a deeper understanding of who a person is or who a time period is. And that allows us to start thinking about structural approaches. Somebody in the chat just said something about a Renaissance text and addressing Leonardo da Vinci. I've seen a really interesting conversation happen around censorship and book editing. It was in a 10th grade class about editing, and they looked at bad editing, right? They were kind of making the assignment was a joke. It was about bad editing choices. And one of them ended up referring to Leonardo da Vinci's, Michelangelo's nephew, who edited all of his poetry to turn it straight. So, you know, there were some interesting things there, bad editing choices across history. So we have to look at ways that we can kind of co-create these opportunities in our classroom with our students, with our teaching teams. So we can actually come out and say gay for a particular purpose that is joyful. How do we lean into expression and contribution? How do we use those as as foundational questions, exploring, right? We put on our hats as lesson creators when we think about all parts of the lesson, those overarching questions that we have that drive the investigation for our students. Do we start to ask bigger questions that address gender identity, sexual orientation as a fundamental point of knowledge to understanding the breadth and the depth of a person that we're investigating or a time period that we're investigating? I like to think about this a lot in my head as I go out and explore the world. I look at an art show. I'm reading a new book. I'm thinking about, a current poet that I'm reading. If they're coming from this place that is, they're affirmed in their identity, I'm able to read that in a different way and connect with it on a number of different levels. So too are my students, by saying that all of their identities are a part of their experience as they are reading something, as they are looking at something, as they are experimenting in a lab, right? They're all coming to it from their positions, and we affirm all young people when we do that kind of work. And we have to kind of separate it. And so here's a little tiny piece. The next slide, I think, Allison.
You got it, friend. Thank
you. Is that joy is different than pride. And I kind of want to differentiate that for, especially for educators that are going to lean into June, which, hey, lean into June, bring on all the rainbows. It's good stuff. I'm here for a lot of that, right? That's a gathering. That's a social celebration. But joy is a little bit different than that, because the impact of that, feeling that potential of joy and seeing joy in others, reminds us of our worthiness. And that's where we want our students to show up and operate from, is to find their worth in our classrooms. I think about this a lot, when we teach and we think about your career, a decade in, 5 years in, 20 years in, and you start to do the math on the number of young people that you've worked with. Let's think about how many leave your room feeling of themselves that they are capable, that they have self-worth. That's not a single lane feeling. It's not, I write a good essay, so I'm worthy. They are thinking of themselves as a whole student, even when we're only evaluating them on perhaps one skill. And so this joyful piece, it's necessary for us to find not just the happy point, but the fact that they are participating in creating a history that is joyful for them and their peers, and will be the joy that young people after them look for.
Which brings us back to your sustainability piece, for sure.
Right. Yeah. And it's a big thing. And that becomes that function of expression, how we express ourselves with each other, thoughtful language, thoughtful approaches to things, our ability to stop a negative event that's happening, to interrupt that. Allison and I kind of have a kind of protocol that we'll use. We kind of call it like a stop, wait, or a revisit and respond. When we are addressing negative scenarios that are interrupting our joyful moment, right? When you get a kid that comes on there and says a terrible thing, that puts us in a really tough spot. And so we have to acknowledge what that does to us as educators. The moment that we have to, we feel a little bit of fight or flight. And I encourage all of you to, if that moment happens to you, I hope it doesn't, but most of us it does, you stop it, you wait on it, you address that student and say, you didn't say the right thing, it was inappropriate, it was hurtful, it violated our classroom agreement, whatever the case may be. And then I'm going to come back to this when I'm prepared, because it hurt me also.
And I'm gonna speak a little bit to that, because I'm lucky enough to be engaging with colleagues right now. We took training with the Anti-Defamation League, and we're really starting to commit to anti-bias and anti-discrimination work in my district. And part of that is structured around the ability to have these difficult conversations. And I want to reinforce the fact that you are allowed to take a breath. The most hurtful or damaging or dangerous thing you can do is not to address the situation at all. But you can address the situation by saying, what you just said or what you just did is wrong, but I need a little bit of time to collect my thoughts before we talk about why, because your reaction also matters, and how you handle that. Because at the end of the day, unless something is exceptionally violent, and the difference, this piece where we can educate around why something was wrong, why something did violate the norms or the expectations that we have in our classroom, why it violated somebody else's sense of identity. That education piece is probably one of the most important pieces that we can have, because that'll be the difference between a student continuing a behavior and a student stopping to understand why that behavior cannot be continued. I have a lot of colleagues who have taught me that, and I work with them in that. And so I want to put that piece out there. And also, my train of thought just went kapoo, but just also to remind you that, being able to address a situation and say that it's problematic is the most important thing. Like, don't let it go. And when the other thought comes back to me, I'm totally going to interrupt Kate and give it to you.
Good. So as we sort of kind of tie, hopefully bring this in towards the end of this here, we understand that teachers are addressing multitude of scenarios in their professional lives. You're addressing homophobic or transphobic language. You're trying to assess in the moment whether it's intentional or ignorant, and if it's ignorant, how do you educate on that in a moment? In that quick moment, do you need to stop, revisit, respond? Some of us are in districts where we're dealing with faith-based pushback. How are we talking with students who perhaps hold a particular faith-based value, and what does that look like when we're trying to say that is good and fine and your own, but that's not in the context of the history that we're discussing in this moment, or it's not part of the critical questioning of the moment. So we really are talking a lot about human-centered approaches or human rights-centered approaches to the content. We're in a moment where we're receiving parental pushback. Sometimes it's as much as an email. Sometimes, your department supervisor or beyond that ends up getting involved, which is why we say, get it approved in lesson plans first. We can deal with the rest after that. And we empower teachers. There's a lot of great projects happening in the state right now. NJEA has projects. There are centers like Kane Center associated with a number of colleges, Brookdale's Change Center, Rowan, that are working with teachers to empower them with amazing information and practices to come back into the classroom. We are navigating individual students. You may have a huge roster, 100 plus student, 200 plus students, and you're dealing with multiple kids with disclosure challenges around their identity. We have some supports that are part of linked to this that will go out to you regarding that. And I will say there's CLEO pushback as well. When we don't have colleagues in good faith, that can undo some of the work we're trying to do as a district, but it never undoes the work that you're doing in your own room. And that, attaches itself to the one person model, right? You can be that one person to a number of students. Students will find you. I'm certain that it's harder in other levels or schools. There's a school I know of in New Jersey that's only a 6th grade school, right? So I'm sure it's a little bit more difficult in a building like that, where there's a kind of homogenous approach to something. But remember your purpose. Remember, it's all hands on deck, and you can move people to be your ally. You don't have to play the hard bargain, but you can get people to work with you in this.
Capacity building is huge, right? Finding people who will help you with this and casting that net out. And sometimes that first cast is not going to bring you back many people, but you continue to cast it out and you'll continue to find more and more people, especially if you provide training or support. This is not, a lot of us will find ourselves doing this work by ourselves for a little while, but you'll find the people who are willing to do it with you, who want to do it with you, who know it's imperative that they do it with you. So you will absolutely build that capacity, and it's crucial to this work. And don't be afraid to ask for help, right? If you can't find somebody in your own building, at the end of this, you can always reach out to us and we can connect you with people, close to you if it's not us to help you with this work. But there's nothing wrong with asking for help. And especially, as we're talking about being proactive instead of reactive, work out your scenarios, work out your fears, talk to somebody about how to handle a situation. We, for some reason, think that teachers only need a mentor for their first year. I still need mentors, right? I've been at this since 2000. I still need mentors because other people just have a different approach or a different idea. So do not ever fear asking for help. Nobody is perfect and nobody has all of the answers.
We use the windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors because it helps reframe you in a moment, right? You can always lean back into it and ask yourself those questions. We think that when it comes to a lot of this work, a great place to start is through text, through literature. It's a great place for us to look for concrete representations of identity. Certainly, it's not the be all end all. There's lots of ways to kind of look for how the text use is then embedded into other practices or investigations. And these are great ways to bring people on board with you, right? Looking at that sort of book list, what you're going to use for summer reading, what's going to be choice reading, et cetera.
Please include your librarians. Please include your librarians. They're incredible resources as far as, first of all, there's just too many librarians who are retiring and not being replaced. They also just have all of the absolute resources, and they can also prepare you like rock stars for any potential pushback against a resource.
So, as we tie this piece up, and there are some questions that I know have come in through the chat. There's one that I see right now. And then I don't know if Sarah or Dara, you have been recording or bringing some of those questions.
Let's just take a quick time out. We're going to send you our slide deck. These are a bunch of resources that we think that you can use. This is specifically resources based around language, equitable language. And then this is our contact information so that you can haunt us with questions that you might have after this. So that way I can stop sharing and we can talk about questions.
So we stop sharing. There you go. So we went at you all. Thank you, for being with us through all of this. And so I'm just going to start with the first question that I see here, and then I'm sure there's more way further back in the chat. There's suggestions for younger elementary K-5 students, and I know that it was asked in the chat what grade levels the mandate covers, and it's middle school through high school, with most of us erring on the side of grade 5 being a logical start, from a number of standpoints. So when we're talking about preparation for that, I do think it's germane to think about a crosswalk. Whether you're a regional district, a K-12, or some other, you have sending districts, it's important to start thinking about the foundation that you're laying for educators after you. And I would say pre-K-5, especially, are places where we are gathering language, where we are gathering habits and practices around how to address our peers, where the seeds of empathy are really sown in the school. We hope that empathy is a part of parenting, of course, but there's a big piece of this that happens in school with, how we share and how we treat each other, and protocols around all of that. And the teacher and the program as a whole is a lead. And so you are modeling all the time, which is probably the preeminent way to approach younger or early education, is understanding that what you model and demonstrate, the language that you use with the young people, the books that you choose for, whether it's the school part of it or the enjoyment part of it, the games that you allow young people to play in the classroom. These all model what you're willing to accept as how we treat each other, period. And then they learn more along with that language, the way that as humans, we've used language to classify and sort and do all this work. That hasn't really benefited us, right? So
Kate has such a really pretty way of saying everything. What I would also say is, if you want book lists, I can provide them for you. I actually helped somebody today put together book lists for 3rd and 4th grade. Books are always a great introductory place for conversations and things like that. I know one of my favorite books to use is Not Quite Norwal. Books that introduce this idea of, of not, I'm going to go to what Robyn said before. If a child is young and they're telling you who they are and what they are, you have to listen to them. And I'm seeing it at the elementary school level a lot, but also teachers who are sort of surprised or not knowing how to broach that conversation with the other kids in the class. And so using using a book like that is just a beautiful entryway to, you know, understanding that just because somebody looks like one thing does not mean that that's who they are, and we shouldn't make assumptions about who people are until they tell us who they are. And so that's a really great way. And then just the really basic stuff too, like, please, let's not divide things up by boys and girls anymore. Let's not do anything in that way. Allow students to play with what they want to do, be who they want to be, pick teams differently. Like, all the really basic things that we have been doing need to kind of to stop.
Thank you. Thank you all. If we can give, you know, silent claps or, you know, emojis on Zoom, round of applause to our 3 presenters today. Thank you. Allison, I think that's a really good lead up into the first question that we have. So what other prefixes are available for classroom educators that don't want to use the standard Mr. or Mrs.?
So
Go for it.
I use MX in some of my communications. So, you know, mix Okeson, but that's because I'm a last name person at school. And sometimes my kids are like, we want to do a prefix for you. So that's been a thing that's happened.
Yeah, I was always a last name person too. I mean, truthfully, in my ideal world, we wouldn't do that at all. Like, Mrs. Connolly is my mother-in-law. And, you know, it's like there's that part. And like, I prefer, I don't find it too casual, too unprofessional to use a first name. But my students technically refer to me as just Connolly. And truthfully, I taught them for 3 years. So there were some by the end who just called me mom. And I was totally cool with that too, right? Or they would give it back to me since I called them pumpkin or whatever, they would call me that. So I think there's, you know, I think again, just as the same way we're going to allow our students to tell us what we want, they want us to call them, we can provide that to them as well.
Wonderful, thank you. This next question is something that I think a lot of the teachers that we work with have, but you know, this was sent anonymously, and I think there's a reason why. What is your advice for teachers who work in a district where their administration is supportive, but members of the community and or board of education are not?
Do you want to start with the law, Robyn?
Yeah, we'll let Robyn start with the law.
Yeah, I mean, I always tell people that in terms of when you're getting pushback from parents, that you can always say, I'm sorry, but this is the law, and I am required by the law to do this. I know that can be a very unsatisfying answer for the parent, right? Or a school board member, but the law is the law, and you are in safe space to say, I'm following the law. I mean, I know, I forget whether it was Kate or Allison earlier spoke about making sure you have certain things in your lesson plans so that nobody can say, wait a minute, I didn't know you were doing this. And so if you have a supportive administration and you're putting it in your lesson plans and they're being approved and you're following the law, you should be protected. And I don't want anybody to have lawsuits, and I don't want anybody to have employment lawsuits. But I mean, again, you have to follow the law. I mean, at the end of the day, even if your school board is screaming, you know, we want you to do this, if it's not what the law requires you to do, you have to follow the law.
And I mean, I've worn a lot of hats, and school board member was one of them. And I think that is, I think that's one of the, you know, the most important things to remind school board members is that they have a job and they're an elected official, and their number one job is they can't write policy around a law. If the law is in existence, then they have to follow it. And, you know, it depends. Like, we do have, you know, we have to be honest here, right? We have a concerted effort to get more people on school boards who are not affirming of all students and who have agendas that are counterintuitive to the one that all of us sitting here have right now. And so that's going to bring a unique amount of challenges. But at the end of the day, you know, the superintendent is the only person on that dais who can hire or fire you. So you need to pay attention to the way that your superintendent reacts to the board. Are they on board with their board, or do they know that they are, in opposition to their board and they support you? What you have to be mindful of how much a school board kowtows to community pressure. But at the end of the day, like, we have to follow the law, and until we are told otherwise, this is what we're going to do.
I think that there is definitely sort of softer approaches in conjunction with that, which are, an investigation into why the parent or parents are approaching you or your department or your school like that, right? There's, I think that by following a line of questioning around what the opposition is, you can clearly show that you are not violating a personally held belief, right? Because that doesn't actually center itself in a student learning standard, right? And so there are other mechanisms in place besides just law per se that help you navigate the conflict that is coming in from the outside. There's a question. I see there's a hand raised.
There's a hand raised.
Gail Henry, is that right?
We don't have the unmute feature enabled, so the questions have to come through the chat.
Okay.
Yes, but thank you.
Right.
There is another question while whoever has their hand raised puts their question in the chat. Speaking of the Board of Education, the board is specifically mentioned in the mandate. So what is their role within districts for incorporating this mandate in schools?
So at the end of the day, one of the things the school board has to do is approve the curriculum, right? Like, that's one of their jobs. So it's their job to, and Robyn can correct me at any point, but as I understand it, when we have a mandate like this, then there's a curriculum redesign or a curriculum implementation that has to go through, and that curriculum document is ultimately approved by the school board. And when a mandate comes into place, it's also the school board's job to make sure that curriculum upgrade happens, and that the resources that are needed to support it and all of that stuff happens, and also that any related policy also is signed in. So there's policy through your policy maker, if it's stress S majors or school boards, whoever it is, that also supports this mandate or where it's located or how it's implemented. And so it's basically the voting to approve, which technically should really just be performative because the mandate is the law. But as we've seen, some school boards think that they have the power to overthrow that too.
The mandate covers that there is representation in the curricula, and that the school board has the resources, identifies the resources, and to that effect, we know that the intention that resources was financial. So buying texts, preparing or buying curriculum, or paying for curriculum to be written. And this is sort of backed up because it is represented under the financial category in CUSAC. It is not under the curriculum category, unless you're a county that has rewritten or updated your own local CUSAC documents. So, the board is fairly limited in terms of what they're supposed to do. Is very well directed, I'll say, or singularly directed. But your curriculum committee, the board's curriculum committee, your director of curriculum and instruction, your immediate department supervisor, there's a great deal of work that can happen on those levels as a result of that, because you know your own curriculum process. In my district, every curriculum template at the very head of each individual course that is written. All of our teachers write our own courses in our school. We do not purchase a single curriculum. So the document that we are using lists for your course and grade level, content area and level, which mandates are going to be applicable and you must refer to for any of the curriculum writing that you do. That's the first step that we take as teachers. Besides, once that curriculum then goes through revision, approval, up to the board for approval, right? It gets kicked back. We go through a huge approval process. Then you have the lessons and resources portion that end up as your unit writing and your individual lesson writing in classes.
Thank you. Our next question is, if gender is not based on sex assigned at birth and social norms, what can we explain that gender is based on?
It's a social construct. I mean, I don't know how everybody else wants to go. I actually am brought into classes to do lessons on the idea of like gender being a social construct designed to, implement power in different structures, right? But that's probably more esoteric than what we're looking for right here. So I'll punt.
And when I was talking earlier about the concept of gender identity, I mean, that's a specific construct in and of itself. I mean, that's a little bit separate from gender and gender roles and things of that nature. As I said, I knew from a very early age that I was female, even though I was assigned male at birth. That was my gender identity. I knew intuitively who I was. I didn't know what the roles that brought with it. I didn't know that, females acted this way, males acted this way. I just knew who I was. And that was what I was trying to convey in terms of what gender identity is, that deeply held knowledge that every person has of who they are. And for some people, most people, it aligns with their sex assigned at birth. For some people, it doesn't.
Thank you. What kinds of support or resources can teachers recommend for students who let them know that they would like to transition or are questioning their gender identity?
I will also punt in a minute, but one of the things that we didn't have an opportunity to talk about, but I would is I really encourage all districts to put a gender support plan in place. We in my district, we utilized materials from Gender Spectrum, and it's a fantastic document and it's exceptionally thorough. And part of what that does is allow whoever in your district wants to take it. In my district, it's primarily our SAC. But they sit down with the student and they talk to them about, who they are, how they want that to impact school. Like, is it something that's going to go across the board through student information systems? Everything that you touch is going to have, the name and the gender that you are, or are we hiding parts of that because people aren't supportive at home? And so it's only going to go to a certain level. And it asks the questions in a way that really allows the students to have like a super thoughtful talk, about it, to make sure that they are protecting themselves, not inadvertently outing themselves, if they don't want home to know and stuff like that. It's like the number one answer I can give for us in our district is this gender support plan and the process of properly training people around using that support plan.
And I would just second that. Somebody mentioned earlier that I do training with Dave Nash and Legal One, and the gender support plan is critical. It's a great resource.
Reading question in the chat.
Thank you, Robyn and Allison. While we're going through that question in the chat, another question that came up is, do you recommend workshops for teachers and parents to do together in harmony outside of school hours?
I'm not touching that one.
I think it's important that we start bringing adults into the loop on this. I think that a lot of adults, and I'll be honest with you, as far as language is concerned, I try not to call them parents because so many of my students are not being raised by traditional parent figures. So I do think that it's important to bring students, adults into these conversations because there's a lot that they don't know. And sometimes their treatment of their own children, especially if their children come out or things like that, is driven more by fear or by ignorance than by knowledge. I also think that there's something to be said when we start talking to parents about comprehensive sex and physical education standards and DEI mandates and things like that, so that we can dispel the boogeyman and actually give them an idea of what's actually happening in classes. So I do think that those sorts of community conversations are important. I'm not entirely sure about doing them with teachers. That would be something I would really have to ruminate on for a little bit. Kate?
Yeah, I think that schools, and we know that there's been a change over many decades, that we function more and more like a community center, right? We have a lot of different stakeholdership. And I think that, you have to be aware that all stakeholdership is not always in harmony, right? Like we are functioning as teachers with a lot of directives around being mandatory reporters, right? We're functioning with a deep knowledge of student learning standards. These are not the same places that your parent community or the folks that are raising the young people that are coming to school together with you every day are necessarily coming from. So are there appropriate places for all stakeholders to kind of be in concert together and learning? Yes. But they don't really exist, I think, in the ideal way. You know, they tend to be more support group focused. They tend to be people that are opting in from an affirmative place. And so it's harder to actually get at training or classes or things of that nature. We have a kind of a complex question in the chat, and I actually want to start with part of the end of it. And there's a question about saying that we're not male or female gender at birth. And I kind of want to refer back to some of the definitions earlier in the talk about sex assigned at birth and gender identity as two separate things, right? We're talking about an assigned correlation between external genitalia and a letter that's put on a birth certificate and gender identity. And Robyn did make a distinction about that being different than biological sex. And the reason for that is that we're not accounting in this larger conversation for people with intersex variations. And so that's, you know, I think that probably you saw in the news this week about athletics and intersex athletes and the International Olympic Committee, you know, changing some of their rulings because we know that there are literally hundreds of genetic variations that create a spectrum between what we understand as cisgender male and cisgender female. Hundreds that can or cannot be expressed externally. And so there are people who that is a primary identity, right? It is not even a gender identity necessarily. People in the intersex rights community will talk about this is not about sexual orientation. It's not about a stringent gender identity, but it is something else because it's a biological determination. I think I'm being clear in that. Robyn, would you help me with that?
No, you're absolutely clear on that. And in terms of gender identity and why I and many advocates shy away from using biological sex is because, as Kate just said, most scientists believe that there's a genetic component to gender identity. There's a book called The Gene. It's the study of the genome. It's written by Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee. I usually have it when I'm speaking sitting next to me so I can hold it up because I can't spell his name. But it's Siddhartha Mukherjee. He also wrote the book, The Emperor of All Maladies, the biography of cancer. He's a beautiful writer. He's a wonderful, intelligent doctor. And in his book, The Gene, he explains exactly what Kate was just saying, but beyond just intersex conditions in terms of gender identity and how various genes that should turn on sometimes don't, and genes that shouldn't turn on sometimes do, and that can impact gender identity. So since your genome is part of your biology, it's not appropriate to say biological sex when talking about what someone's sex is when they are assigned at birth.
There are a couple of other things about court cases and laws nationally that are happening, and we'll return to that in a moment. I want to just start with a question about application and protection of teachers that are members of the LGBTQ AI community as well. The mandate has nothing to do with our protections under the law. The law against discrimination does impact our protections under the law. So as a worker, you know, as a worker, as a homeowner, like all the things, right? Like that's the law that I need to lean into based on my identity. You know, there are challenges. I know in my union hat, addressing some concerns that members may have around HIB and whether that applies to teachers and where the line is between HIB and those particular power dynamics and populations and using affirmative action to address things like that, or is it discriminate, right? So there's a lot of moving parts, but the mandate is about educational materials educational outcomes, right? So it's attending to what we have to put into curriculum and lessons. The other ones are a lot about what we're seeing nationally. And Robyn and I talked briefly the other day about, what's too political in this conversation with everyone here. We're watching a tremendous amount of, I'll call it news, but legislation being moved forward that's limiting or restricting or eliminating access to affirming healthcare. It is looking to criminalize people who participate in affirming healthcare for young people before age of majority and adults in some spaces. And what I will say about that is that even though there are a couple of unscrupulous characters in New Jersey who have tried to put some legislature like this forward, luckily it's not getting anywhere because they're morons. But besides that, we do have really strong and, as Robyn had said, since the 40s, we have one of the oldest laws against discrimination in the nation. We have one of the strongest comprehensive laws against discrimination, and it would be hard to enact these kinds of legislation in light of the longstanding protections that are in place for all of us as people. Not impossible, but not likely right here, right now. But it's a checkerboard of places that are okay at this very moment. And what this will lead for is a Supreme Court will end up, I'm sure, addressing some of this at some point.
Please don't underestimate the impact of all of this on your trans students.
That was the next thing.
They're paying attention, they're hurting, they're scared. I have engaged in conversations in this past week with trans kids who are watching this happen, and they're very fearful because they don't understand politics the way that some of us do. They don't understand the machinations that would be necessary for these kinds of laws and changes to come to our state. What they see is that they're happening in other places, and could they happen too here? And also that is sort of coupled with what I'm sure many of you have probably seen in your own schools, which is an uptick in homophobic, transphobic language and behaviors, thanks to people making it seem like it's okay. And this idea that this is something that should be, legal or delegitimatized somehow, or any of those things. So we can also provide you with resources for that. But this along, it's been a rough week to be a kid, right? Like, I know my kids are coming to school right now, hurting over school shootings, hurting over, what's happening to trans students and trans people throughout the country. Like this, they do internalize that. So please don't underestimate that.
And just to follow up on Allison's point, and then to flip back to Kate's point, in terms of the kids and the impact that all of this is having on them, I will tell you that I am a 70-year-old trans woman. I transitioned 14 years ago. All right. It impacts me to hear the hatred, to hear people say in public spaces that transgenderism should be eradicated from the public. To hear those kinds of words, I don't care how old you are, it impacts you. And for the kids that might not fully understand it, to hear people spouting hate about them just because of who they are, it's going to be really hard. So I just want to really emphasize what Allison was saying, that be there for your kids, because this is a tough time, especially for the kids. And the laws, some of them, are frightening. Florida and Arkansas have both proposed laws that would ban me from using the ladies' room, would require me to use the men's room. And people don't think of the consequences of what they're doing because they're trying to keep me out of the ladies' room. But there's some trans men that if you saw them, they're big, they're burly, they have full beards, they are rough, tough guys, and you're going to require them to use the ladies' room because they were assigned female at birth. I don't know how well that's going to play once that goes into effect. So there's that. And just, I guess I don't want to be negative, but I mean, we're two election cycles away in New Jersey from things changing. That's number one. And we're 1 or 2 Supreme Court decisions away from things changing, because federal law can trump state law. And if the Supreme Court says that because of sex in Title IX does not include transgender people, and there's a president who says we're going to remove Title IX funding if you don't follow the Supreme Court mandate, that could change the game in New Jersey. So as an advocate, I worry. I worry because the things outside the state of New Jersey can come to New Jersey either from politicians in New Jersey changing or from federal mandates or Supreme Court decisions.
We understand that young people may not have all the facts when they're making decisions also, right? So a piece of this is like, you have a community or a culture that says queer and trans kids commit suicide at a higher rate. And that becomes a correlative, right? Because they're queer or trans, they commit suicide. And that's not the case. It's because of the society's structural inequities that leads towards lowered mental health, wellness, well-being, et cetera. These are part of and associated with like minority health models. There's a great new book out about called Weathering. I just heard the author's interview on public radio the other day, talking about sustained stressors and how it changes people on cellular levels, right? So it's affecting their health and well-being. And hearing these news items that young people, and it's not even like I'm thinking about the people that I love, not just, you know, folks in the queer community, but the trans community, non-binary community, who are part of my circle of loved ones who are impacted by this. And it's very hard in a stressful moment to say, I'm going to be really rational about this and think this through and do the rational thing. It doesn't affect you like that. It's emotional, and that gets carried with you. And our young people are bringing in this information with them in school every day. And to Allison's point about some of the uptick in negative behaviors that we've seen, biased behaviors and incidents, it's the same, but the flip side of that coin, right? Those perspectives are upheld, so they're being perpetuated also by a population of young people. So we are in a tough spot in education, right? Living at the intersection, trying to unpack all of that simultaneously with people in our classrooms.
We've gone grossly over time, haven't we?
Okay.
It's more important that if people have questions, we're able to address them. This is the space to do it. This is our brave space for us to work together. And I'm just grateful from my end, you know, watching the chat and reading the comments, that even folks who may not be, as you said, comfortable with the content are here and they're listening and learning. And that's the best thing we can sometimes ask from each other, is that we don't all have to agree on things, but we have to put our kids first and put their safety and well-being first. And that may mean getting over some of our own, you know, biases or prejudices, you know, or moving past the belief systems that we have towards something that is more equitable and frankly keeps our kids alive. So by all means, you know, people who have to leave have jumped off, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Our next question is, are there schools creating, you know, groups within the school that would involve the importance of civic awareness or involvement of politics?
There's a difference between sort of civic education. I'm not a history teacher, so I'm going to kick this one to Allison in a second, but there's a difference between civics education and how clubs are established or groups that are established in schools, right? And so if I kind of understand that, you know, schools creating groups in my mind is immediately seen as a club, which, you know, that has to be student centered and generally brought forward by a student, and they don't outlaw that, so to speak, in a school district. But there's generally a rigorous process around that. And politics per se are something that are taught as part of the student learning standards. And this is where I'm going to say, hey, Allison, you can talk about this.
Politics are in fact part of the standards, and so is civics. We have a civics mandate now, right? So both of those things are being taught through classes, but like that fundamental idea of putting those lessons into action to say, get kids around advocacy or issues that have to do with it, definitely fall into the purview of clubs, but that does kind of have to be handled in a certain way, right? Because, you know, depending on your district, whatever clubs do, you have to provide the opposite for it. So like you could have a club that's all here to support all of this stuff, but then at the same time, there could be a club that is formed that does the opposite. You know, I know there's a lot of GSAs and different groups around there, and depending on the level of involvement they have in their schools, they do, especially at the high school level, kind of get to an advocacy place where they can, you know, go outside the school and advocate or inform or educate people, which is fabulous. I know in high school, our AP government and politics class, they internship, and they are involved in like going out and working with political offices. So there's but they're not necessarily doing advocacy, but they're learning how government functions at the cellular level through their work. But I think this is something that's going to be largely like local, right? Like it's going to differ from school to school and district to district.
There was a follow-up about schools that are doing this, and I don't know if this you mean like any kind of engagement with civics and politics. There, you know, there is a school group I know in Central Jersey that's a club for dreamers, DACA recipients, and they actually have a legislative trip that they do every year. They go and learn how to lobby and talk to legislators, and they go to Washington, D.C. It's super excellent, and it's school sponsored. It's through their own club. They raise money to do it. So there are ways that I think these things as ideals are expressed, but I don't know, you know, I don't know if they exist in terms of like kind of all kinds of advocacy.
I also know that the League of Women Voters runs a really awesome program around me. I don't know where else they do it, but it's for women, and they bring in political leaders from all sides, from all ranks, and they talk to junior girls about what political advocacy and activism looks like, how to run for office, you know, and even go so far as to teach them how to research and present an issue. They make them go attend a mock board meeting and go through all of the steps of identifying a problem, providing a solution, even looking at the monetary aspect of that solution, and then presenting it to people for, you know, response to kind of get to that. So there's, that's a fabulous program. And Lisette, if I'm not wrong, you're in BRIC, and so I do that you should be able to participate in that. It's called Running and Winning.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Okay, I don't see any additional questions in the chat. So if everyone could please give another virtual round of applause for our three fantastic presenters. I hope you see the acknowledgements that you're getting in the chat. Everyone is so appreciative. I know I am. We thank you so much for being here. And we thank all of you for joining us tonight. You know, to have more than 200 people here is truly incredible. And the change that we're going to make for our students goes beyond just what is done tonight. So thank you again, Robyn, Allison, and Kate, and we look forward to seeing everyone soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.